She had built her empire from nothing: boardrooms, billion-dollar deals, respect earned in every corner of the corporate world. But on one flight, all of that power meant nothing. A steward tapped her shoulder, asking her to move. For someone else, someone white. In that moment, the air in the cabin turned heavy, and every pair of eyes seemed to watch. She could have walked away quietly. Instead, what she did next would send shockwaves through the industry and end careers overnight. How did a single seat turn into a battle for dignity heard around the world? Simone Carter was the kind of leader headlines loved to praise. A self-made billionaire CEO, she had clawed her way out of a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Detroit to the top floors of glass towers that overlooked entire cities. In the corporate world, her name was synonymous with vision and resilience. Her mornings were a blur of high-stakes board meetings, investor calls, and signing contracts worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Yet despite her power, she still carried herself with the same quiet confidence she'd had when she was a young woman working 2 jobs just to pay her tuition. That week was supposed to be different, a rare moment to breathe. She had just finalized a historic merger, one that promised to bring thousands of jobs to struggling communities that had been ignored for decades. The deal was her personal victory, the culmination of years of relentless work. Her company rewarded her with a first-class ticket home, a small luxury for the woman who had made it all possible. To the airport, she moved through the terminal with practiced ease. A tailored navy suit, polished black heels, and her favorite gold watch, every detail spoke of a woman in command. Security officers greeted her by name. At the gate, flight attendants smiled warmly, their tone almost deferential. Boarding early, she settled into her white leather seat near the front of the cabin. The hush of first class was a welcome contrast to the chaos of her work week. She powered on her laptop, ready to review notes for her next project. But as passengers trickled in, the atmosphere shifted. Flight attendants exchanged quick, hushed words. A man in an expensive camel coat stood at the entrance, scanning the cabin with an unsettling smirk. Simone barely noticed. She didn't yet realize this flight would become the stage for a humiliation so brazen it would ignite a chain of events no one could stop. The hum of the engines was almost soothing as Simone scrolled through her emails. She barely noticed the first attendant pause at her row, leaned toward her, and asked softly, "Ma'am, could you please step aside for a moment?" It was unusual, but she assumed it was a minor seat adjustment or a catering check. She unbuckled, moved into the aisle, and waited. The attendant didn't meet her eyes. Instead, she stepped back toward the galley, whispering to a colleague. Moments later, the man in the camel coat stepped forward, tall, silver-haired, exuding an air of practiced entitlement. He slid into Simon's seat without so much as a glance in her direction. Simone blinked, certain there had been some mistake. "I'm sorry," she said to the nearest attendant. "That's my seat." The woman's expression tightened. "We've had a change in seating arrangements. You'll be relocated to business class." Relocated. The word felt clinical, like an airline term for inconvenience, but this wasn't an inconvenience. This was a demotion, a quiet removal from the space she had been assigned and paid for. "Why?" Simone asked it, her voice calm but firm. The attendant hesitated, her eyes darting toward the man, who had already reclined and accepted a glass of champagne. "The passenger has certain status with the airline," she said finally. Status? Simone had plenty of status. Lifetime platinum, million miler. But she didn't need to ask what kind of status had just overridden hers. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen, but very much aware. A few glanced at Simone, then at the man, their expressions tight with something between guilt and complicity. "Please follow me, ma'am," the attendant urged, her voice now a little sharper, as though this delay was an inconvenience for everyone else. Simone stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of every eye on her. Years of corporate diplomacy taught her to choose her battles, but something about the smug stillness of the man in her seat lit a fire in her chest. She didn't move. "Ma'am," the attendant said again, her tone clipped. "We need to prepare for takeoff." It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about the quiet assumption that she didn't belong there, that even at the pinnacle of her career, she could be asked to step aside. No explanation needed. Finally, a second attendant approached, a man this time, with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "If you don't comply, we may need to delay the flight." Simone felt her pulse quicken. The implication was clear. Comply, or you become the problem. The difficult passenger, the disruption. She took a slow breath, gathered her bag, and walked toward the divider. But she didn't head for business class. She stopped in the aisle, turned back, and studied the cabin. The man didn't even glance at her. Somewhere behind her, a phone camera clicked. Someone was recording. Simone slid into her reassigned seat, her mind racing. Every instinct told her to let it go, to get through the flight and move on. But as she stared at the curtain separating her from the front of the plane, she felt the sting of something far bigger than inconvenience. This wasn't about airline policy. This was about who was considered worthy of the best seat and who could be quietly shifted out without a second thought. The hum of the engines grew louder, but so did the pounding in her ears. She thought of the countless times she'd been underestimated, talked over, or asked to wait her turn. In spaces she had earned her way into .by the time the plane lifted off the runway. Simone knew one thing for certain. This wouldn't end here. The flight had been in the air for just over an hour when Simone felt the pressure in her chest become unbearable. She hadn't touched the drink offered to her in business class. She couldn't. Every sip would have tasted like surrender. Through the thin curtain separating her from first class, she caught glimpses of the man in her seat laughing, gesturing broadly, holding court as if he owned the plane. She didn't need to imagine the smug satisfaction he felt. She could see it in the casual way he leaned back, champagne glass in hand, the seat reclined to its limit. Her mind replayed the exchange at the gate, the dismissive tone, the word relocated, echoing like a verdict. A verdict she had heard in other forms her entire life. Not for you, not your place, not where you belong. Then she noticed something else, the woman across the aisle in business class holding her phone low, angling it toward the front of the cabin. She mouthed the words, "I got it on video." It was as if a switch flipped. Simone stood up, walked forward, and pulled the curtain aside. Every head in first class turned. The man in her seat barely looked up. "Excuse me," Simone said to the nearest attendant, her voice steady but loud enough to carry. "I need to speak to the captain." The attendant blinked, startled. "Ma'am, the captain is busy. This will take less than 30 seconds, Simone cut in. "And it concerns an incident of discrimination happening on your aircraft right now." The murmur in the cabin grew louder. Someone behind her whispered, "Is she serious?" Phones began to rise from tray tables. The attendant shifted uncomfortably, but before she could answer, Simone turned to the passengers. "I was removed from that seat," she said, pointing directly at the man, "after paying for it in full, with no valid explanation other than a vague reference to status." She let the word drip with contempt. "The only difference between myself and the man sitting there is the color of our skin." The silence that followed was electric. The man finally looked up, his smirk faltering. "That's ridiculous," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Ridiculous?" Simon's tone sharpened. "I've been flying for 20 years. I've built a company from the ground up. I've earned every mile, every dollar that paid for that seat. And yet, in the eyes of this airline, all of that can be erased. I can be erased because someone else decided I didn't belong here." The captain emerged from the cockpit, his expression tight. "What's going on here?" Simone didn't hesitate. "What's going on?" she said, meeting his gaze, "is that your crew just made a choice that tells every passenger watching exactly whose comfort matters most and whose doesn't." A ripple went through the cabin. The woman with the phone nodded toward Simone. "It's all on video," she said aloud. "Everything." The captain's eyes darted to the attendants, then to the man still in Simon's seat. The tension was a living thing now, thick, unyielding. Simone could feel the years of swallowing smaller slights, the quiet humiliations, the let it go moments, all condensing into this one decision. She knew she could sit back down and let the flight continue. She also knew that silence would be the real seat she'd never escaped from. She straightened her shoulders. "I want my seat back." Now, the captain didn't move. The man didn't move. The whole cabin seemed to be holding its breath. And then Simone said the words that would detonate everything. "Fine. When we land, every single person responsible for this will be unemployed by tomorrow morning." The captain didn't say a word at first. He just looked at Simone, then at the man in her seat, and finally at the row of passengers silently filming. The pressure in that cabin was heavier than the thin air outside the plane. Finally, without ceremony, the man in the camel coat stood. His jaw was tight, his cheeks flushed. He muttered something under his breath as he gathered his bag, but no one bothered to respond. Simone slid back into her rifle seat, not with the relief of victory, but with the steady, cold focus of someone who had decided this moment was far from over. The rest of the flight was silent. The attendants avoided her eyes. Passengers kept sneaking glances, some with sympathy, others with shame. When the wheels touched down, Simone was the first to stand. Her phone was already in her hand. Before she even stepped off the jet bridge, she had called her head of legal, her head of HR, and her public relations director. She laid out exactly what had happened: names, faces, positions. By the time she reached baggage claim, the gears of her company were already turning. Within 24 hours, the airline's regional director was on the phone, voice trembling with apology. But it was too late. The videos had gone viral. Hashtags were trending. News anchors replayed the footage, debating what it said about status, privilege, and who is quietly told to step aside in America's most polite spaces. For Simone, it wasn't about revenge, it was about visibility. She had spent years in rooms where injustice happened behind closed doors, invisible to anyone without power. But this time, the world had seen, and she knew she couldn't waste that. Her company cut ties with the airline that week, cancelling a multi-million-dollar corporate travel contract. The crew members involved, gone. The executives who failed to act quickly enough, reassigned or replaced. She made sure the message was clear. There are consequences for prejudice, whether it's blatant or dressed up in professional courtesy. But even with the decisive outcome, the incident stayed with her. Because she knew her story was rare. She had the influence, the resources, the platform to demand justice. Most people in her position, black, female, alone in a space where they're already seen as an outsider, don't have that luxury. The truth was harder to swallow. For every Simone Carter who makes headlines, there are thousands who endure the same quiet, cutting disrespect with no cameras rolling and no one to call for backup. They're told to move seats, step out of line, wait their turn again and again until they begin to believe. That's just the way the world works. Maybe that's why this moment mattered so much. Not because she won a seat on a plane, but because she refused to let the story fade into another footnote in the long ledger of everyday racism. She knew the problem wasn't just one flight crew or one entitled passenger, it was the unspoken rules about who belongs where and who can be removed without question. So, she spoke. She acted. She made sure her story would not be forgotten, because until those unspoken rules are broken, the next Simone on a plane, in a boardroom, in a classroom will face the same silent calculation. Do I fight, or do I swallow it down? And maybe the real question for all of us is this: when it's your turn to choose, will you have the courage to stand your ground, or will you look away